The emergency call came in at 8:57 p.m. during the loudest part of the Blackwater Winter Carnival. In the background of the recording, Christmas music played through distorted speakers while hundreds of voices blended into one chaotic wall of noise. Children laughed somewhere nearby. Vendors shouted over one another beneath rows of glowing white lights stretched across the town square. Then came the voice of Daniel Mercer, low, controlled, and frighteningly calm for a father reporting a missing child. "My son is gone," he told dispatch. "We can't find my son." Blackwater was the kind of town people moved to because it felt untouched by the ugliness of the outside world. Nestled beside a dark frozen lake and surrounded by endless pine forests, the town looked almost unreal during winter. Snow covered the rooftops like thick white blankets, old brick storefronts glowed with warm yellow lights, and every December the annual winter carnival transformed the center of town into something that belonged on a postcard. Families traveled from neighboring counties for the skating rink, fireworks, roasted chestnut stalls, and horse-drawn carriage rides circling the lakefront. People trusted Blackwater. Parents trusted it enough to let children run ahead alone. That trust died the night Ben Mercer disappeared. 7-year-old Ben was the youngest son of Daniel and Julia Mercer, one half of Blackwater's most admired pair of families. The Mercers and the Holloways were wealthy, respected, and inseparable. They vacationed together, celebrated birthdays together, and raised their children almost like siblings. To outsiders, they looked perfect. Ben himself was impossible not to notice. Small for his age, with pale skin, wide brown eyes, and thick dark hair constantly falling across his forehead, he carried a softness that made strangers instantly protective of him. Witnesses later described him as shy but sweet, the type of child who stayed close to adults in crowded places. That night, he wore a navy blue winter coat with silver buttons, black gloves attached to his sleeves with string, and a bright red scarf wrapped twice around his neck by his mother before they left home. At 8:43 p.m., Ben stepped off the skating rink after telling his older sister Chloe he needed the bathroom. Nobody saw him again. At first, the disappearance barely registered as danger. Children wandered constantly during the carnival. Daniel Mercer searched the nearby food stalls while Julia checked the public restrooms near the parking lot. But within minutes, panic began spreading through the family like poison. Witnesses would later remember Julia Mercer's face more than anything else. Her mascara had already started running by the time police arrived, dark streaks trailing down pale cheeks reddened by the freezing wind. Her breathing became shallow and uneven as she grabbed strangers by their coats, asking if they had seen her son. Every answer that came back empty seemed to physically weaken her. At one point she collapsed beside the rink, clutching Ben's abandoned scarf to her chest, while sobbing so violently paramedics considered sedating her. Daniel Mercer reacted differently. Tall, sharply dressed, and normally charismatic enough to command any room he entered, Daniel moved through the crowd with cold determination instead of panic. Snow collected across the shoulders of his black wool coat while he organized volunteers into search groups and repeatedly insisted Ben was probably nearby. Several officers later described his behavior as strangely composed. Not emotionless, just controlled. Too controlled. By 9:30 p.m., the carnival no longer felt festive. Police lights flashed against falling snow while officers searched wooded trails surrounding the lake. Helicopters swept spotlights across frozen water. Parents hurried children into cars. Rumors spread through the town faster than facts. Some claimed a predator had been spotted near the bathrooms. Others swore they heard screaming from the tree line. Fear infected Blackwater with terrifying speed because every parent there understood the same thing at once. If a child could disappear here, nowhere was safe anymore. Detective Helena Voss arrived shortly after state police established a perimeter around the carnival grounds. Helena looked exhausted before she even stepped from her vehicle. At 43, years of homicide investigations had hollowed sharp lines beneath her gray eyes and drained almost all softness from her expression. She wore a long charcoal overcoat over dark slacks, leather gloves, and boots still stained with old winter salt from previous crime scenes. Unlike the uniformed officers rushing through the chaos, Helena moved carefully, studying everything. And almost immediately, something felt wrong to her. The area outside the skating rink where Ben was last seen looked too clean. No signs of struggle. No dragged footprints leading toward the woods. No scattered gloves or disturbed snowbanks. It was as if the child had simply vanished into thin air. 3 days later, Blackwater Lake gave him back. The body was discovered just after sunrise by a volunteer diver near the frozen northern shoreline. Ben Mercer had been chained to a submerged concrete anchor beneath 12 feet of freezing black water. By then, media trucks lined the streets outside the Mercer home, while national reporters described Blackwater as a grieving town terrorized by evil. The arrest came quickly. A local drifter named Raymond Hale was taken into custody after witnesses reported seeing his blue van near the carnival that night. He had prior convictions involving minors, disturbing journals filled with violent fantasies, and enough nervous, erratic behavior to terrify investigators during interrogation. When footage leaked showing Raymond eventually confessing through tears, Blackwater celebrated like the nightmare was over. But Detective Helena Voss kept staring at the crime scene photographs. Ben's shoes were spotless, perfectly clean. Someone had wiped them down before police recovered the body. And standing beside the frozen lake that night, while snow drifted silently across the dark water, Helena realized something she would never forget. The killer had been standing among the search party the entire time. Chapter 1. Two Perfect Families. Blackwater never fully recovered after Ben Mercer's death. The town still looked beautiful from a distance. Snow continued falling across the frozen lake every winter. Storefront windows still glowed warmly at night beneath old brick buildings wrapped in Christmas lights. Families still gathered inside crowded cafes along Main Street pretending life had returned to normal. But beneath the surface, Blackwater had changed in ways people rarely admitted out loud. Parents no longer let children walk home alone after dark. Doors that once stayed unlocked now closed before sunset. Every conversation eventually drifted back toward the same terrifying question. How had a child vanished from the middle of a crowded carnival without anyone seeing it happen? 3 years later, Ben Mercer's face still haunted the town. His memorial photograph remained inside the lobby of Blackwater Elementary beside rows of fading flowers and melted candle wax permanently stained into the wooden shelf beneath it. Teachers lowered their voices whenever his name came up. Children who once played with him were old enough now to understand what death meant, and the understanding had stolen something from them. Blackwater had become quieter since the murder. More suspicious. More afraid. Nobody felt that fear more deeply than the two families left behind. The Holloways lived 4 houses down from the Mercers inside Blackwater Heights, an expensive neighborhood overlooking the frozen lake. Their homes sat side by side at the end of a curved street lined with dead pine trees and old Victorian-style lamp posts that glowed amber at night through drifting snow. Both houses were massive, elegant, and cold in the way wealthy homes often became during winter. Large windows reflected empty rooms. Fireplaces burned constantly, but never seemed to warm the silence hanging inside them. From the outside, the families still appeared inseparable. Daniel Mercer and Ethan Holloway had been best friends since university. People in town often described them as opposites who somehow balanced one another perfectly. Daniel Mercer was tall, athletic, and effortlessly charismatic, with dark hair brushed neatly back and a calm confidence that drew people toward him the second he entered a room. Even grief had not fully stripped him of that charm. He smiled easily during public gatherings, shook hands firmly, and always looked directly into people's eyes when they spoke to him. But something about him had hardened since Ben's death. His expressions lingered a little too long now. His silences felt heavier. Ethan Holloway carried grief differently. Where Daniel remained socially polished, Ethan had become emotionally withdrawn. He was broader than Daniel, with tired gray eyes, thick dark stubble, and the permanently exhausted appearance of a man surviving mostly on whiskey and sleepless nights. His career as a criminal defense attorney had already given him a reputation for being intimidating before Ben's death. Afterward, people started avoiding him entirely. He snapped more easily, drank more openly, smoked alone outside during neighborhood parties while staring toward the frozen lake behind the houses as though expecting something terrible to emerge from it. Their wives completed the illusion of perfection. Julia Mercer had once been one of the sharpest investigative journalists in the county before leaving her career to raise children. Beautiful in a restrained, elegant way, she carried herself with controlled poise even during emotional moments. Her dark blonde hair remained perfectly styled no matter the weather, and years spent interviewing dangerous people had taught her how to hide discomfort behind carefully measured expressions. But grief had hollowed her from the inside. Since Ben's death, she rarely laughed naturally anymore. Everything about her now looked practiced. Claire Holloway disturbed Detective Helena Voss the most. Claire was striking without trying to be. Soft brown hair rested just above her shoulders, framing pale skin and thoughtful green eyes that always seemed moments away from tears. As a pediatric doctor, she moved through conversations with effortless warmth, touching people gently when they spoke, remembering names, listening carefully. Everyone trusted Claire Holloway. Mothers trusted her with sick children. Teachers trusted her opinions. Police officers trusted her grief. Maybe too much. Because every time Helena Voss watched Claire and Daniel together, something felt wrong. It was never obvious. Never enough to justify suspicion. Just small moments hidden between ordinary interactions. A hand resting too long on a shoulder. Eye contact lasting 1 second beyond comfort. Silence that felt intimate instead of awkward. During neighborhood dinners, Claire unconsciously watched Daniel when he spoke the way married people watched each other after years together. And once Helena noticed it, she could not stop seeing it. The children sensed the tension too, even if they did not understand it. Noah Holloway especially had changed since Ben's death. At 15, Noah had grown tall and lean like Ethan, with restless gray eyes and the nervous energy of someone whose mind never fully quieted. He became obsessed with old newspaper articles about Ben's murder, secretly reading archived interviews late at night while the rest of the house slept. Something about the case bothered him in ways he could not explain. One snowy evening, while searching through old storage boxes in the Holloway basement, Noah discovered a photograph hidden inside an unmarked envelope. The picture showed Claire and Daniel standing alone together years earlier beside Blackwater Lake, and they looked far too close to be just friends. Chapter 2: The Wrong Man. By the second week after Ben Mercer's murder, Blackwater wanted someone to hate more than it wanted the truth. The grief hanging over the town had begun curdling into paranoia. Parents walked children directly into classrooms each morning instead of dropping them off at the curb. Store owners installed cameras above entrances that had remained unguarded for decades. At night, porch lights stayed on across entire neighborhoods overlooking the frozen lake. Blackwater no longer felt like the quiet lakeside town people once trusted. It felt hunted, and frightened towns eventually demanded blood. Raymond Hale became the perfect offering. His trailer sat nearly 6 miles outside Blackwater, near an abandoned logging road swallowed by pine forest and snowdrifts. The structure itself looked diseased, rust spreading along the aluminum siding, broken windows covered with taped garbage bags, cigarette burns blackening the tiny porch steps. Police photographs later released to the media showed filthy dishes stacked inside sinks, stained mattresses on the floor, and walls covered in disturbing sketches of faceless children drawn in thick black marker. The images horrified the public before the trial had even begun. Raymond himself looked exactly how people imagined monsters should look. 42 years old, painfully thin, and pale from years spent indoors, he carried the nervous, twitching energy of a man permanently uncomfortable inside his own skin. Sparse blonde hair clung unevenly to his scalp while deep purple exhaustion sagged beneath his watery blue eyes. During interrogation footage, his hands shook constantly. He avoided eye contact. Sweat darkened the collar of his wrinkled gray sweatshirt despite the freezing temperature inside the station. The town saw the footage and immediately decided Ben Mercer's killer had finally been caught. Detective Helena Voss remained unconvinced. She sat silently at the back of the interrogation room while 2 county detectives questioned Raymond beneath harsh fluorescent lighting that turned his already sickly skin almost gray. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee, damp winter clothing, and cigarette smoke dragged in from officers pacing outside. Raymond looked terrified from the moment questioning began. Not angry, not defensive, terrified. That mattered to Helena. Real predators behaved differently during interviews. Most denied everything aggressively or manipulated conversations entirely. Raymond simply looked broken. Every answer came out fragmented and uncertain, as though he were trying to survive the interrogation rather than control it. Then came the confession. At 11:14 p.m., after nearly 9 straight hours of questioning, Raymond finally lowered his head into trembling hands and whispered, "I took the boy." The detectives exchanged immediate looks of triumph. One officer leaned forward aggressively, asking Raymond to explain exactly how he abducted Ben Mercer from the carnival. Raymond hesitated for almost 8 full seconds before answering. Helena noticed the delay immediately. His breathing became shallow. His eyes moved briefly toward Detective Warren Pike seated beside him, the lead county investigator who had spent most of the interrogation pressuring Raymond relentlessly. Then Raymond spoke. He claimed he grabbed Ben near the restroom area behind the skating rink before dragging him toward the woods beside Blackwater Lake. According to the confession, Ben screamed and fought while Raymond forced him into the van. But Helena already knew something Raymond should not have overlooked. Nobody heard screaming that night. Not one witness. And there was something else. Ben Mercer's body showed bruising along the wrists consistent with restraint, but there were no defensive injuries beneath his fingernails. No skin traces. No torn fibers from an attack. Forensics had quietly noted signs suggesting Ben may have known the person who approached him before his death. Children usually fought strangers. Ben apparently had not. The deeper Raymond went into the confession, the worse it became. His timeline shifted repeatedly. Certain details contradicted physical evidence. At one point, he incorrectly described Ben's winter coat as green instead of navy blue. Detective Pike quickly corrected him off camera before restarting the taped confession. Helena noticed that too. Someone was feeding Raymond details. Outside the station, Blackwater celebrated. News vans crowded the streets while reporters described Raymond Hale as the monster of Blackwater Lake. Residents gathered outside the Mercer home, holding candles and signs thanking police for protecting the town. Julia Mercer cried openly during interviews while Daniel Mercer stood beside her with an arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, looking exhausted but composed in his black wool coat beneath falling snow. Only Helena noticed how strangely calm Daniel always seemed. 3 years later, Noah Holloway became obsessed with those old interviews. Now 15, Noah spent most nights alone inside the dim basement office beneath the Holloway home while the rest of the family slept upstairs. Thin, restless, and emotionally sharper than people realized, he inherited Ethan Holloway's gray eyes and tendency toward quiet obsession. The room smelled faintly of dust, printer ink, and old paper as Noah scrolled endlessly through archived newspaper articles about Ben's murder on a glowing laptop screen. That night, buried inside an old discussion forum attached to a local news archive, Noah found something strange. A witness comment posted anonymously 3 years earlier. It read, "Ben wasn't afraid of the person who took him. He walked toward them willingly." Then came the final sentence. The killer knew the family personally. Chapter 3. The Biology Project. By the time the biology assignment began, Blackwater had spent 3 years pretending the Mercer case was over. The town still carried the scars of Ben Mercer's murder, but people learned how to bury fear beneath routine. The cafes overlooking Blackwater Lake reopened their outdoor seating during winter festivals. Children returned to skating on the frozen rink where Ben had last been seen alive. News crews disappeared. The candles outside the Mercer home eventually stopped appearing. Life moved forward because people needed it to. But some grief never actually leaves a place. It settles into walls, into silence, into families. Blackwater High School stood on a hill overlooking the frozen lake, a massive red brick building surrounded by pine trees permanently dusted with snow. During winter mornings, fog rolled across the football field while students hurried through the parking lot wrapped in coats and scarves, their breath rising in pale clouds beneath gray skies. The hallways smelled faintly of old textbooks, wet boots, and industrial heater vents that clicked constantly during cold weather. Inside room 214, Mr. Adrian Bell wrote the word genetics across the whiteboard in thick black marker. Adrian Bell had taught biology in Blackwater for nearly 20 years. Thin, soft-spoken, and permanently exhausted-looking behind rectangular glasses, he carried the careful patience of a man who genuinely loved teaching despite working in a town slowly poisoning itself with secrets. His thinning brown hair was always slightly disheveled, and his wrinkled button-up shirts constantly smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers. Students trusted him because he treated them like adults instead of children. That trust would eventually destroy him. The assignment itself sounded harmless. Students were instructed to map inherited traits and blood types using family medical histories. Eye color, dominant genes, genetic probability. Most teenagers treated it like busywork, but Noah Holloway immediately became obsessed with it. At 16, Noah had grown taller and leaner than most boys his age, with Ethan Holloway's restless gray eyes and permanently tense posture. Grief and obsession had sharpened him over the years. He spoke less now, watched people more carefully, Since discovering inconsistencies surrounding Ben Mercer's murder, Noah had developed the unsettling habit of quietly studying conversations instead of participating in them. Across the room sat Chloe Mercer. For years older than Ben had been when he died, Chloe carried his absence everywhere she went. Her dark brown hair fell straight across pale shoulders, often partially hiding her face whenever she became uncomfortable. Unlike Noah's restless energy, Chloe had become emotionally withdrawn after her brother's murder. Quiet, observant, nervous around sudden noises. Teachers often described her as fragile. That morning, Noah noticed Chloe staring unusually hard at her worksheet. Then she frowned. "Mr. Bell?" she asked quietly. The room barely paid attention at first. Adrian looked up from his desk. "Yeah." Chloe hesitated before speaking again. "My blood type doesn't make sense." A few students laughed softly. Adrian walked toward her desk with the casual patience of someone expecting a simple mistake. But the moment he examined the worksheet, his expression changed almost imperceptibly. "What are your parents' blood types?" he asked. "My mom's AB positive," Chloe answered. "My dad's O negative." Adrian nodded slowly. "And yours?" "A positive." He became very still. Nearby, Noah instinctively checked his own assignment again. His stomach tightened immediately. Claire Holloway was listed as AB positive. Ethan Holloway was O negative. Noah's own blood type: A positive. The exact same inconsistency. Mr. Bell pulled a chair beside Chloe's desk while the classroom noise gradually faded around them. His expression remained calm, but something uneasy flickered behind his glasses now. He lowered his voice carefully, aware students nearby had started listening. "That's unusual," he said. Noah stared toward the whiteboard, pulse beginning to hammer inside his chest. Unusual. Not impossible, but close. Mr. Bell quickly tried recovering the moment with an awkward smile. "Medical records can be wrong sometimes," he added casually. "Hospitals mix things up more than people realize." But Noah noticed the hesitation, the calculation happening behind the teacher's eyes. That afternoon, Chloe mentioned the assignment during dinner. The Mercer home immediately went silent. Daniel Mercer stopped cutting his steak mid-motion. Even beneath the warm dining room lights, his expression hardened almost invisibly for a fraction of a second before recovering. Tall, controlled, and still devastatingly charismatic despite years of grief, Daniel had mastered emotional restraint better than anyone in Blackwater. But Chloe saw the reaction. So did Julia. Claire Holloway reacted worse. When Noah casually brought up the same assignment later, that evening inside the Holloway kitchen, Claire nearly dropped the wine glass in her hand. The color drained visibly from her face, while her green eyes locked onto Noah with sudden panic she failed to hide quickly enough. For one terrifying second, Noah saw something raw beneath her carefully maintained warmth. Fear. Real fear. That night, after midnight, Daniel Mercer sat alone inside his dark home office illuminated only by laptop light reflecting across his face. Snow drifted outside the windows overlooking Blackwater Lake, while the rest of the house slept upstairs. For nearly an hour, Daniel silently deleted old emails one by one. Hotel confirmations, medical appointments, private conversations, anything connected to Claire. The next morning, Adrian Bell never arrived at school. By noon, police discovered his abandoned car parked beside Blackwater Lake with the driver's door hanging open and his phone still sitting inside. Chapter 4. Noah Holloway vanishes. The argument between Noah Holloway and his mother lasted less than 4 minutes. But years later, Detective Helena Voss would replay those 4 minutes in her mind more than any other moment connected to the case. It happened on a Thursday evening during the first heavy snowfall of December. Outside the Holloway home, wind pushed icy flakes across Blackwater Heights in violent spirals while the frozen lake behind the neighborhood disappeared beneath thick fog. The Holloway house itself stood dark and imposing against the storm, a massive stone and glass structure overlooking the water, beautiful in the sterile, expensive way Ethan Holloway preferred. Warm yellow light spilled from tall windows onto the snow-covered driveway, while dead pine trees scraped softly against the roof in the wind. Inside, the atmosphere felt colder than outside. Claire Holloway stood alone in the kitchen when Noah confronted her. She wore soft gray loungewear beneath the warm overhead lights, her pale skin almost colorless against the dark marble countertops surrounding her. Her shoulder-length brown hair remained neatly tucked behind one ear, though her hands trembled slightly while pouring wine into a glass she never actually drank from. Claire had spent years mastering the appearance of calm compassion. Patients trusted her instantly because she moved gently, listened carefully, and carried sadness in her eyes that felt genuine. But Noah no longer trusted anything about her. At 16, Noah had inherited Ethan Holloway's sharp gray eyes and restless emotional intensity, though grief and obsession had hardened him far earlier than most boys his age. He stood tense in the kitchen doorway, wearing a dark winter hoodie still dusted with snow from outside. His jaw remained clenched so tightly the muscles visibly shifted beneath his pale skin. Without speaking, Noah placed the biology worksheet onto the counter between them. Claire looked down. The moment she saw the blood types written across the page, something inside her visibly collapsed. Noah noticed immediately. Not confusion. Not surprise. Fear. Real fear. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. Claire stared at the paper without answering. The kitchen suddenly felt suffocatingly silent, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock near the pantry. "Noah," she whispered carefully. "Don't lie to me." His voice cracked harder than he intended. Years of grief poured beneath the sentence all at once. Ben Mercer's murder. The strange tension between the families. The hidden photograph beside the lake. The missing biology teacher. Every unanswered question that had poisoned Noah's thoughts for months now sat directly between him and his mother. Claire stepped toward him slowly. "It isn't what you think." Noah laughed bitterly. "That's what people say before telling the truth." The sentence hit her harder than he expected. For a moment, Claire looked physically unable to breathe. Her green eyes filled instantly with tears she struggled to contain while one trembling hand pressed against the kitchen counter for support. Then Noah asked the question she feared most. "Is Ethan even my real father?" Claire's silence answered him. Outside, wind slammed snow violently against the kitchen windows. Noah stepped backward slowly as understanding began spreading across his face like horror physically taking shape. His breathing became uneven. He looked suddenly younger again, not like an angry teenager, but like a frightened child realizing his entire life might have been built on lies. "You ruined everything," he whispered. Then he left. The front door slammed hard enough to shake framed photographs hanging inside the hallway. Seconds later, Noah's bike tires disappeared into the snow-covered street outside, while Claire remained frozen inside the kitchen, tears finally spilling down her face uncontrollably. She did not follow him. That decision would destroy her for the rest of her life. At 11:16 p.m., Blackwater police received a report of an abandoned bicycle discovered near the wooded trail bordering the frozen lake. The caller described signs of possible violence nearby. Detective Helena Voss arrived 21 minutes later beneath flashing patrol lights that painted the falling snow blue and red across the trees. The scene instantly reminded her of Ben Mercer. Noah's black mountain bike lay partially buried beside the road near the forest entrance. One tire still spun slowly when officers arrived. Nearby, his cell phone had been smashed repeatedly against something hard enough to shatter the screen completely. Snow around the phone showed partial footprints already disappearing beneath fresh snowfall. But again, there were almost no signs of struggle. No dragged marks. No blood trail. No evidence Noah had fought his attacker. Helena's stomach tightened immediately. She had seen this before. Meanwhile, Ethan Holloway became the investigation's first unofficial suspect almost overnight. Witnesses described hearing Ethan screaming at Noah earlier that week near Blackwater High School. Officers knew Ethan's reputation as a ruthless criminal defense attorney who specialized in protecting violent offenders. Rumors spread quickly through town that Ethan drank heavily and suffered explosive tempers behind closed doors. By sunrise, people were already whispering the same terrible theory. Maybe Noah discovered something about his father, and maybe Ethan silenced him. 3 days later, while snow continued falling across Blackwater Heights, Claire Holloway opened the garage door expecting to leave for work. Then she started screaming. Noah Holloway's body had been placed carefully in the driver's seat of Ethan Holloway's car. Chapter 5: The Affair Theory. Noah Holloway's funeral poisoned what little trust remained inside Blackwater. Snow fell steadily throughout the service, covering gravestones and pine branches in thick white silence, while mourners gathered beneath black umbrellas around the cemetery chapel overlooking Blackwater Lake. The frozen water beyond the hill looked almost colorless beneath the gray December sky, stretching endlessly into drifting fog. Reporters stood behind police barricades near the entrance gates while camera lenses followed every movement made by the Holloways and the Mercers. People no longer looked at the two families with sympathy alone. Now they looked at them with suspicion. Claire Holloway sat motionless in the front pew, wearing a long black coat buttoned tightly around her thin frame. Her pale skin appeared almost translucent beneath the chapel lights, and her green eyes looked swollen from days without sleep. Grief had hollowed her completely. She barely reacted as mourners approached, offering condolences, because part of her seemed trapped somewhere else entirely. Frozen inside the moment she found Noah's body inside Ethan's car. Daniel Mercer sat 3 rows behind her beside Julia and Chloe. Tall, controlled, and devastatingly composed even now, Daniel wore a charcoal wool coat perfectly tailored against his broad frame, while snow melted slowly across his dark hair near the chapel entrance. Most people still viewed him as the stable one between the families, the reliable one. But Detective Helena Voss had started noticing how often Daniel watched Claire when he thought nobody else saw him. The looks lasted too long. The concern felt too personal. And eventually Blackwater noticed too. Rumors spread quietly at first. 2 women overheard discussing hotel receipts inside a cafe near Main Street. A bartender claiming Daniel and Claire once disappeared together during a charity gala years earlier. Anonymous comments online questioning whether Noah discovered something about the families before he died. In small towns, suspicion moved like infection. Once an idea entered people's minds, it spread faster than facts ever could. Julia Mercer heard the rumors before Daniel did, or at least before he realized she knew. She sat alone inside the Mercer home late one night while icy wind rattled against the windows overlooking the frozen lake. The house felt enormous now, too quiet, too empty after Ben's death and Chloe's emotional withdrawal following Noah's murder. Dim kitchen lights cast pale reflections across marble countertops while untouched tea cooled beside Julia's folded hands. She kept replaying moments she once ignored. Claire touching Daniel's arm too casually during dinners. The photograph Noah discovered beside the lake. The panic on Claire's face after the genetics assignment. And suddenly, the memories stopped feeling innocent. At 1:17 a.m., Julia walked into Daniel's home office for the first time in years. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood, expensive cologne, and old paper. Dark shelves lined the walls beside framed architectural awards Daniel collected throughout his career as a luxury home developer. Snow drifted outside tall windows overlooking Blackwater Heights, while the desk lamp cast warm amber light across neatly organized files and expensive leather notebooks. Daniel always kept the office obsessively clean. That night, Julia noticed something slightly off. One drawer beneath the desk had been pushed closed too quickly. Inside, beneath property contracts and old financial records, she found a small black burner phone wrapped in a hotel towel from a resort 2 counties away. Her pulse immediately quickened. Julia stared at the phone for nearly 10 full seconds before powering it on with trembling fingers. Dozens of deleted messages remained recoverable. Most were incomplete, but one survived almost entirely. "We can't keep hiding this forever." The message was signed. "C." Julia stopped breathing. Beneath the phone sat old hotel receipts dating back nearly 17 years. Different cities, different dates, always booked under fake names. Hidden beneath those receipts was a photograph folded carefully enough to suggest someone had opened it many times before. Claire and Daniel stood beside Blackwater Lake years earlier during summer. Not touching, but intimate in the unmistakable way lovers became after years together. Julia's hands started shaking violently. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Holloway became consumed by a different kind of fear. The more police investigated Noah's death, the more evidence seemed to circle directly back toward him. Anonymous tips described violent arguments between Ethan and Noah. Financial records surfaced showing Ethan purchased the same type of chains used to weigh down Ben Mercer's body years earlier. Even Noah's body being discovered inside Ethan's car felt grotesquely intentional now. Someone was building a case against him piece by piece. And Ethan knew it. At nearly midnight, Detective Helena Voss returned to her office after another 14-hour shift reviewing evidence connected to Noah's murder. The homicide division sat nearly empty except for buzzing fluorescent lights and old heating pipes knocking faintly inside the walls. Exhaustion pulled heavily beneath Helena's gray eyes as she dropped case files onto her desk. That was when she noticed the envelope. No stamp, no return address, just her name written in black marker. Inside sat a single folded piece of paper. Helena opened it carefully. The sentence typed across the page stopped her cold. The children are dying because they know the truth. Chapter 6. Mason's recording. By the time Mason Mercer disappeared, Blackwater had stopped believing in coincidences. 3 children connected to the same 2 families were now dead or missing, and fear had settled permanently over the town like winter fog over Blackwater Lake. Parents no longer allowed teenagers outside after sunset. High school football games ended early because crowds refused to stay once darkness covered the streets. Every unfamiliar car triggered neighborhood alerts online. The town had become exhausted from grieving and terrified of what came next. Detective Helena Voss had started privately considering something even worse. Maybe the murders were not random at all. Maybe someone was systematically destroying both families from the inside. Mason Mercer sensed it too. At 17, Mason carried Daniel Mercer's height and athletic build, but none of his emotional restraint. Broad-shouldered, sharp-featured, and permanently angry at the world, Mason moved through Blackwater High like someone daring people to challenge him. Teachers described him as volatile. Coaches called him difficult. After Noah Holloway's death, he became even harder to control. Fights started following him everywhere: locker rooms, parking lots, parties. Grief had sharpened every emotion inside him into something dangerous. But beneath the anger was fear. Real fear. The Mercer home no longer felt safe to him. On the night everything changed, freezing rain hammered against Blackwater Heights while most of the neighborhood slept. Mason returned home early from football conditioning just after 8 p.m., exhausted and soaked from practice. The large Mercer house stood glowing dimly against the storm overlooking the frozen lake, its tall windows reflecting black water and dead pine trees swaying violently in the wind. The moment Mason stepped inside, he heard shouting upstairs. Not ordinary arguing. Panic. He froze near the staircase immediately. Daniel Mercer almost never lost control emotionally. Even after Ben's murder, Daniel remained composed with terrifying consistency, calm voice, measured breathing, carefully controlled expressions. But that night, Mason heard something he had never heard before. Fear in his father's voice. "You should have told me sooner," Daniel hissed upstairs. Claire Holloway answered sharply. "I didn't know Noah kept digging." Mason's pulse instantly accelerated. He moved silently up the staircase until their voices became clearer through the partially open office door near the hallway. Inside, Daniel stood beside the desk with one hand pressed against the window overlooking the frozen lake. Tall, broad, and still painfully charismatic even under stress, he looked different tonight, pale, exhausted, unraveling. Claire stood opposite him wearing a dark wool coat over gray clothes, her green eyes swollen from crying. Neither noticed Mason outside the door. "You think this stops with Noah?" Claire whispered. "Mason knows something's wrong too." Daniel dragged trembling hands across his face. "Then we handle it." The sentence chilled Mason instantly. Claire looked horrified. "Don't say it like that." Daniel lowered his voice further. "If the DNA comes out, everything collapses." Mason's stomach tightened violently. DNA. The same word Noah became obsessed with before he died. Heart pounding uncontrollably now, Mason quietly pulled his phone from his pocket and activated the voice recorder. Claire continued pacing anxiously across the office carpet. "People are already talking about us." Daniel's expression hardened. "They can talk all they want. Talking isn't proof. And what happens if Helena gets the records?" Silence. Heavy. Terrifying. Then Daniel answered quietly enough Mason almost missed it. "Then we make sure she doesn't." Mason stopped breathing. The storm outside intensified, rain striking the windows hard enough to sound like gunfire against glass. Inside the office, Claire suddenly looked toward the doorway instinctively. Mason ducked backward instantly. For nearly 10 seconds, he remained frozen against the hallway wall listening to footsteps approach the door. His pulse hammered so violently he thought they might hear it. Then the footsteps stopped. The office door slowly closed. Mason waited another full minute before moving again. Back inside his bedroom, he replayed the recording repeatedly through headphones while staring at the dark ceiling above him. Every instinct screamed the same terrifying truth now. Noah had been right. Something deeply wrong connected the two families. And somehow, it involved the children themselves. The next afternoon after football practice, Mason told his closest friend Tyler Green he needed to show somebody something huge. Witnesses later saw Mason leaving the school stadium alone around 6:12 p.m. beneath heavy snowfall, carrying his black athletic backpack over one shoulder. He never made it home. The disappearance shattered Blackwater completely. Search parties flooded wooded trails surrounding the lake through the night, while police helicopters swept spotlights across frozen water once again. Reporters returned almost immediately, describing the case as a possible serial abduction targeting children connected to the Mercer and Holloway families. Panic consumed the town so quickly schools closed early the following morning. Detective Helena Voss arrived at Blackwater High before sunrise. The football field lights still glowed against falling snow, while officers searched parking lots and nearby woods. Near the edge of the stadium access road, a patrol officer discovered Mason's backpack partially buried beneath fresh snow beside a drainage ditch. Inside sat schoolbooks, football gloves, headphones, and Mason's phone recorder. Helena immediately sent the device to forensic technicians. Hours later, she stood silently inside the evidence lab while technicians attempted recovering the audio file Mason created the night before. The recorder showed clear signs the file once existed, but someone had erased it completely. Every second. Gone. Chapter 7. The Satanic Panic. Mason Mercer's body was discovered 48 hours after he vanished. By then, Blackwater had become a town surviving almost entirely on fear. News vans lined Main Street again. Helicopters circled low above Blackwater Lake from sunrise until dark. Online conspiracy forums flooded with theories linking the Mercer and Holloway families to trafficking rings, ritual killings, and secret cult activity hidden beneath the town for decades. Every parent in Blackwater slept lightly now. Every strange sound outside after midnight felt dangerous. And somewhere inside that fear, somebody was manipulating the story perfectly. The call came in at 5:42 a.m. from a pair of utility workers driving through Briar County Road during heavy snowfall. They reported seeing broken lights glowing inside the ruins of St. Jude's Chapel, an abandoned stone church nearly 12 miles outside Blackwater that locals avoided after dark even before the murders began. The building had partially collapsed decades earlier after a fire destroyed most of the roof, leaving behind blackened beams, shattered stained glass, and towering stone walls slowly being reclaimed by forest. People in Blackwater already whispered stories about the chapel. Teenagers claimed satanic groups met there during winter nights. Drug users occasionally hid there. Hunters swore they heard voices inside the ruins long after midnight. Most of the stories were nonsense. But the killer understood something important about fear. Fear only needed a direction. Detective Helena Voss arrived shortly after sunrise beneath heavy gray clouds. Snow drifted slowly through the skeletal remains of the chapel roof, while red and blue police lights flashed across ancient stone walls blackened by age and fire damage. The surrounding forest stood silent except for wind moving through dead pine branches overhead. Even before Helena stepped inside, she smelled the blood. The interior of St. Jude's looked like something designed to terrify people intentionally. Candles burned around the central altar despite freezing temperatures. Strange symbols painted in black covered the stone floor and walls in uneven circles surrounding the body. Animal bones had been scattered deliberately across the chapel pews, along with pages torn from old religious books soaked in dark red stains. Near the altar, someone had hung dead crows upside down from rusted iron hooks attached to the ceiling beams. And in the center of it all sat Mason Mercer. His body had been posed upright against the remains of the altar, wearing the same dark athletic hoodie witnesses saw him leave school in 2 nights earlier. Snow melted slowly across his shoulders from the collapsed roof above him, while blood dried dark beneath pale skin, already stiffened by winter cold. His head leaned slightly sideways as though sleeping, but his eyes remained open. Helena immediately noticed the expression frozen across his face. Not terror. Recognition. Mason looked like he knew whoever approached him before he died. Outside the chapel, reporters began arriving before forensic teams even finished securing the scene. Within hours, leaked crime scene photographs exploded across national media, alongside headlines describing ritual sacrifice and cult killings in small-town America. Television experts analyzed symbols pulled from blurry photographs, while internet forums flooded with theories about satanic groups operating secretly around Blackwater Lake. The panic became uncontrollable almost instantly. Police tip lines collapsed under thousands of calls. Residents reported suspicious neighbors practicing witchcraft. Former prisoners were harassed publicly. A homeless man nearly died after being beaten outside a gas station because someone claimed he looked satanic. The town desperately wanted monsters that made sense. Meanwhile, the real ones kept attending funerals. Inside the Mercer home, Julia Mercer completely unraveled after identifying Mason's body. She sat trembling beneath heavy blankets in the dim living room overlooking the frozen lake, while paramedics quietly monitored her breathing nearby. Her carefully maintained composure, the polished emotional restraint she carried since Ben's death, had finally shattered entirely. Mascara streaked down her pale face, while shock hollowed her eyes into something almost lifeless. Daniel Mercer handled the tragedy differently. Again, tall, composed, and disturbingly controlled despite losing a second child. Daniel stood near the fireplace, greeting investigators calmly while speaking in measured tones that almost sounded rehearsed. But Detective Helena Voss noticed something others missed. Daniel never once asked about the symbols. Not once. Most parents would obsess over them immediately. Ask what they meant. Ask who could do something so horrifying. Daniel focused almost entirely on timelines, evidence, and whether police had any real suspects yet. As though he already knew the symbols themselves were meaningless. Late that night, Helena returned alone to St. Jude's Chapel after forensic teams finished processing the scene. Snow continued falling softly through the ruined ceiling, while police tape fluttered in icy wind around the entrance. She walked slowly across the chapel floor, studying the painted symbols again beneath flashlight glow. Something about them bothered her immediately. The circles looked wrong. Too symmetrical. Too theatrical. And then she noticed it. One symbol near the altar had been copied incorrectly from a well-known occult symbol guide available online. Whoever painted the scene understood enough to scare people, but not enough to make the symbols authentic. Helena slowly lowered the flashlight. Then she looked toward Mason Mercer's body being removed beneath the falling snow outside. And for the first time since the investigation began, Detective Helena Voss became certain of something terrifying. The occult scene had been staged intentionally. Someone wanted Blackwater looking in the wrong direction. Chapter 8. The Child Who Stopped Speaking. After Mason Mercer's funeral, Chloe Mercer stopped speaking unless somebody forced her to. The change happened slowly at first. Teachers at Blackwater High noticed she no longer answered questions during class, even when directly called on. Friends stopped texting after weeks of receiving nothing back except single-word replies. During lunch periods, Chloe began sitting alone near the far corner of the cafeteria, overlooking the frozen football field outside, while entire conversations unfolded around her unheard. She moved through school like someone permanently listening for danger. And in many ways, she was. Winter tightened around Blackwater harder than ever that year. Snow buried sidewalks beneath thick white drifts, while dark clouds hung low above the frozen lake nearly every afternoon. The town itself felt exhausted now, emotionally hollowed after years of funerals, police investigations, and television crews turning tragedy into entertainment. Parents stared suspiciously at strangers inside grocery stores. Church attendance doubled. Online conspiracy groups blamed everything from satanic cults to corrupt police cover-ups. But inside the Mercer home, the fear had become personal. Chloe no longer felt safe there. The house itself remained beautiful in the cold, sterile way wealth often looked during winter. Tall windows overlooked Blackwater Lake, while expensive modern furniture sat untouched inside dimly lit rooms smelling faintly of cedarwood and expensive candles. But after Mason's death, the silence inside the home became unbearable. Every hallway creak sounded threatening. Every closed door felt deliberate. Most nights, Chloe locked her bedroom door before sleeping. Sometimes she pushed a chair beneath the handle too. At 16, Chloe still carried the same fragile softness people remembered from childhood. Pale skin, straight dark brown hair falling past narrow shoulders, quiet eyes that always looked slightly overwhelmed by the world around her. But grief had transformed her over the years into something painfully withdrawn. After Ben died, she became anxious. After Noah died, she became paranoid. After Mason died, something inside her finally broke completely. Detective Helena Voss noticed it immediately during their next interview. Chloe sat curled into herself inside the Mercer living room beneath heavy gray blankets, while snow drifted softly beyond the windows overlooking the frozen lake. Her hands trembled constantly now. She barely made eye contact. Daniel Mercer stood near the fireplace the entire time with arms folded across his chest. Calm and composed as always in dark tailored clothing despite burying a second child only days earlier. Too composed. Helena never stopped noticing that. Whenever Chloe spoke, Daniel answered first whenever possible. Whenever Helena asked difficult questions, Chloe instinctively looked toward her father before responding. Fear. Not grief. Fear. A week later, Blackwater High assigned Chloe mandatory counseling sessions after teachers reported emotional deterioration. That was how she met Evelyn Harper. Evelyn worked as the school grief counselor and had spent nearly 15 years handling trauma cases involving teenagers across Broward County. Early 40s, soft-spoken, with warm brown eyes and auburn hair usually tied loosely behind her head, Evelyn carried the kind of calm presence grieving students trusted quickly. Her office smelled faintly of herbal tea, old books, and vanilla candles burning beside the window overlooking snow-covered athletic fields. Chloe barely spoke during their first session, or the second. She mostly stared toward the floor while nervously twisting silver rings around her fingers. Evelyn never pressured her. She simply waited, asked gentle questions, allowed silence to exist naturally between them. Slowly, over several sessions, Chloe began speaking in fragments. About nightmares, about Mason, about Noah, and eventually about the fear living inside her own house. The breakthrough happened during a stormy Thursday afternoon while freezing rain rattled softly against Evelyn's office windows. Chloe looked exhausted that day. Dark circles rested beneath swollen eyes while her oversized gray sweater hung loosely from her thin frame. She sat quietly on the couch, clutching a paper cup of untouched tea between shaking hands. Then suddenly she whispered, "My parents lie about everything." Evelyn remained calm. "What do you mean?" Chloe hesitated for nearly 20 seconds. Her breathing became shallow. Then the words finally came. "Noah figured something out before he died." The room suddenly felt smaller. Evelyn leaned forward carefully. "What did he figure out?" Chloe looked toward the office door instinctively before lowering her voice almost to a whisper. "He said we weren't who they told us we were." Evelyn felt cold immediately. That evening, she documented the conversation privately inside encrypted case notes before emailing herself reminders to contact Detective Helena Voss the following morning. She never got the chance. The next day, Evelyn Harper failed to arrive at school. Her car was later discovered abandoned near Blackwater Lake with the engine still running and the driver's door hanging partially open beneath falling snow. Her purse remained inside the passenger seat. So did her phone. But Evelyn herself was gone. 3 nights later, Detective Helena Voss sat alone with Chloe Mercer inside an interview room at Blackwater Police Department while freezing wind rattled softly against the windows outside. For a long time, Chloe said nothing. Then finally, without looking up, she whispered something that made Helena's blood run cold. "Noah said we belonged to the wrong parents." Chapter 8. The Child Who Stopped Speaking. Detective Helena Voss stopped sleeping the week Chloe Mercer mentioned the wrong parents. The sentence followed her everywhere. Through late-night evidence reviews inside the Homicide Division. Through silent drives past the frozen shoreline of Blackwater Lake. Through half-empty cups of cold coffee scattered across her cluttered office desk beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Every instinct developed over 15 years investigating murders kept dragging her back toward the same terrifying possibility. The children themselves had been the secret. Outside, Blackwater remained buried beneath relentless winter storms. Snow-covered rooftops and sidewalks so heavily that entire streets looked abandoned after sunset. The lake behind Blackwater Heights had frozen solid weeks earlier, transforming into a flat sheet of dark ice stretching endlessly beneath gray skies. The town no longer felt alive. It felt suspended, trapped in grief, suspicion, and fear. Inside the police station, Helena quietly reopened every medical inconsistency connected to the Holloways and the Mercers. Officially, she had no authorization. Unofficially, she no longer cared. At nearly midnight, Helena sat alone inside the records division surrounded by stacks of medical files, forensic reports, and printed school documents gathered over months of investigation. Her charcoal overcoat hung across the back of her chair, while exhaustion deepened the sharp lines beneath tired gray eyes. A single desk lamp illuminated the room softly, while snow drifted outside narrow windows overlooking the empty parking lot. The more Helena compared the records, the worse the inconsistencies became. Ben Mercer. B positive. Daniel Mercer. O negative. Julia Mercer. AB positive. Genetically unlikely. Noah Holloway. A positive. Ethan Holloway. O negative. Claire Holloway. AB positive. Again impossible. Helena slowly leaned backward in her chair, pulse beginning to quicken beneath controlled breathing. Then she pulled Chloe and Mason's files. Same inconsistencies. Across both families. It could not be coincidence anymore. The realization felt physically sickening. For years, both families had lived inside a biological impossibility hidden in plain sight. And suddenly Helena understood something else. Every child who died had started questioning identity shortly before disappearing. Ben vanished before the affair rumors surfaced publicly. Noah became obsessed with genetics. Mason secretly recorded conversations about DNA. Chloe told a counselor they belonged to the wrong parents. The pattern finally became visible. Somebody had not been silencing random children. Somebody had been protecting a secret. Meanwhile, Ethan Holloway reached the same conclusion alone inside his house overlooking Blackwater Lake. The Holloway home had deteriorated emotionally since Noah's murder. Dust gathered across untouched furniture. Empty whiskey bottles lingered inside Ethan's office beside stacks of unfinished legal paperwork. Most nights, the massive house remained silent except for heating vents humming softly through dark hallways. Ethan barely recognized his own life anymore. At 45, he looked years older than he had before Noah disappeared. Thick dark stubble shadowed his exhausted face, while permanent sleeplessness hollowed his gray eyes into something harsh and unstable. He drank heavily now. Smoked constantly. Grief had stripped away every polished part of him until only anger remained. That night, he finally confronted Claire. The argument exploded inside the kitchen shortly after midnight, while freezing rain hammered violently against the windows overlooking the frozen lake. Claire stood near the marble counter wearing soft gray clothing beneath warm overhead lights, her pale skin almost colorless with exhaustion. She looked fragile now in ways she never had before, emotionally frayed after years of funerals, lies, and fear slowly crushing her from the inside. Ethan slammed the medical files onto the counter hard enough to make her flinch. "Tell me the truth." Claire stared at the papers silently. Now, his voice sounded broken more than angry. For several seconds, neither spoke. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence between them, while wind rattled the glass behind Claire. Then Ethan whispered the question he feared most. "Were any of them mine?" Claire closed her eyes. That tiny movement destroyed him completely. Ethan staggered backward like something physical struck him. Years of marriage, fatherhood, grief, and identity suddenly collapsed inward all at once. His breathing became uneven while disbelief twisted rapidly into rage. "Noah died thinking I murdered him," Ethan whispered hoarsely. And all this time, Claire finally started crying openly. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The sentence made Ethan snap. He swept glasses and plates violently from the kitchen counter, while screaming so loudly neighbors later reported hearing the fight through snow-covered windows across Blackwater Heights. Years of humiliation and grief erupted uncontrollably now. Claire backed away, visibly trembling, while Ethan stared at her with complete emotional devastation. For the first time, their marriage died openly. Hours later, long after Ethan passed out drunk inside his office, Claire drove alone through falling snow toward an abandoned lakeside cabin outside Bryan County. Daniel Mercer was already waiting inside. The cabin smelled faintly of cedarwood smoke and damp winter air. Firelight flickered softly across old wooden walls, while dark water stretched beyond frozen windows outside. Daniel stood near the fireplace wearing a black wool coat over dark clothing, composed as always despite the chaos consuming both families. The moment Claire entered, he knew. "He found out," she whispered. Daniel's expression hardened slowly. "How much?" "Enough." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel quietly asked, "What about Helena?" Claire looked toward the fire, trembling. "She knows too." At 3:11 a.m., security alarms suddenly activated inside Blackwater Police Department. By the time officers reached record storage downstairs, somebody had already broken inside, and every medical file connected to the Mercer and Holloway children was gone. Chapter 10: Chloe Mercer Vanishes. The storm arrived just after midnight. By 12:40 a.m., freezing rain hammered Blackwater hard enough to rattle windows across the entire town, while violent wind bent pine trees toward the frozen lake behind Blackwater Heights. Power lines swayed overhead. Streetlights flickered constantly beneath sheets of icy rain. Weather alerts warned residents to remain indoors until morning, but nobody in Blackwater had truly felt safe indoors for a very long time. Especially not Chloe Mercer. The Mercer house sat dark against the storm overlooking Blackwater Lake, its tall glass windows reflecting black water and flashes of distant lightning across the snow-covered shoreline. Inside, silence stretched heavily through expensive hallways and dimly lit rooms smelling faintly of cedarwood and old fireplace smoke. Since Mason's death, the home no longer felt lived in. It felt haunted. Chloe had locked herself inside her bedroom hours earlier. At 16, she looked emotionally exhausted beyond her age now. Her pale skin had grown almost colorless over the past months, while permanent shadows settled beneath frightened brown eyes that no longer trusted anyone completely. Her straight dark hair hung loosely around her shoulders as she sat curled beneath blankets on the edge of her bed listening to rain strike the windows. She had not slept properly in weeks. Every sound inside the house terrified her now. Floorboards creaking, doors shifting, footsteps in hallways. Sometimes she convinced herself somebody stood outside her bedroom late at night listening through the door. And lately, she started believing that person might be her own father. At 1:13 a.m., Chloe texted Detective Helena Voss. "I think Noah was right." Helena saw the message almost immediately inside her office at Blackwater Police Department. The station remained nearly empty except for overnight staff and buzzing fluorescent lights reflecting across wet tile floors. Helena had fallen asleep briefly at her desk, surrounded by stolen file reports and surveillance photographs, when Chloe's message illuminated her phone screen. Helena responded instantly. "What happened?" 3 dots appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. Finally, Chloe replied, "I found something in my dad's office." Before Helena could answer, another message appeared. "Someone's outside my room." Helena stood immediately. Rain hammered violently against the station windows while adrenaline cut through exhaustion all at once. She grabbed her coat and keys without waiting for backup. Across town, Chloe sat frozen on her bed staring toward the bedroom door. At first, she thought the sound came from the storm itself. Then she heard it again. A soft movement outside. Not footsteps exactly. Breathing. The chair she normally wedged beneath the doorknob suddenly felt useless. Her pulse accelerated violently while she backed slowly away from the door, clutching her phone tightly, enough her fingers hurt. Lightning flashed outside the windows for half a second, illuminating her bedroom in cold white light before darkness returned. Then came the knock. 3 slow taps. Chloe stopped breathing. "Chloe." Daniel Mercer's voice called softly from outside the room. Instant relief almost overwhelmed her. Then confusion followed immediately afterward. Daniel never checked on her this late. Especially not lately. Rain continued hammering the windows while Chloe stared toward the door trembling. "Chloe," Daniel repeated gently. "Open the door." Something about his voice felt wrong. Too calm. Too careful. Instead of moving toward the door, Chloe quietly stepped backward. Then another voice suddenly echoed faintly downstairs. "Julia." "Daniel." Silence followed instantly outside Chloe's room. Then footsteps moved away down the hallway. Fast. Chloe grabbed her phone immediately and texted Helena again. "Please hurry." 8 minutes later, the entire Mercer house went dark. The storm finally knocked out power across Blackwater Heights, plunging the neighborhood into complete darkness except for occasional lightning flashing across the frozen lake outside. Security systems beeped faintly before backup generators activated automatically seconds later. But Chloe's bedroom camera never came back online. When Julia Mercer reached Chloe's room shortly after the outage, the door remained locked from inside exactly as Chloe always kept it. Julia knocked repeatedly before panic started rising in her chest. No response came back. Daniel arrived moments later. Tall, composed, and strangely calm despite Julia's growing hysteria, he forced the bedroom door open with one violent shoulder strike. The room was empty. The window remained locked. No signs of struggle existed anywhere inside. Only Chloe's phone sat abandoned on the bed beside rain-soaked blankets. Julia Mercer screamed loud enough for neighbors to hear through the storm. By sunrise, Blackwater had descended into complete paranoia. Police flooded Blackwater Heights, while media helicopters returned overhead before dawn even fully broke across the frozen lake. Rumors spread through town with terrifying speed. Some blamed Ethan Holloway. Others believed cult members connected to St. Jude's Chapel had returned. Online forums exploded with theories claiming the Mercer and Holloway families were killing one another. But for the first time since the murders began, Julia Mercer stopped fearing strangers and started fearing Daniel. She noticed small things now she once ignored. How strangely controlled he remained during every tragedy. How quickly evidence disappeared around him. How Chloe became terrified after spending time alone with him. And most disturbing of all, Daniel barely looked surprised Chloe was gone. At 9:42 a.m., search teams discovered fresh footprints leading through the cemetery behind St. Anne's Church near the frozen lakeshore. Detective Helena Voss arrived minutes later beneath gray morning skies, while freezing wind pushed snow across old gravestones surrounding the churchyard. Then she saw the crowd gathered ahead. Officers stood completely silent near the Mercer family burial plot. In the center of the snow, directly beside Ben Mercer's grave, Chloe Mercer's body had been carefully placed facing the frozen lake. Chapter 11. Ava Runs. After Chloe Mercer's body was found beside Ben's grave, Ava Holloway stopped believing anyone inside Blackwater was innocent. Not the police, not the town, and especially not her own mother. The Holloway house had become unbearable after Chloe's death. What once looked elegant and expensive now felt emotionally rotten from the inside. Tall windows overlooked the frozen black surface of Blackwater Lake, while winter storms rolled endlessly across the shoreline behind Blackwater Heights. The heating system hummed constantly through empty hallways, but the home never felt warm anymore. Too many people had disappeared. Too many rooms now sat permanently untouched. Noah's bedroom remained exactly as he left it. Ethan Holloway spent most nights drunk inside his office downstairs. And Claire Holloway moved through the house like a ghost haunting herself. Ava watched all of it carefully. At 17, Ava carried Claire's striking green eyes and Ethan's sharp facial structure, though grief had matured her painfully fast over the past year. Unlike Noah's emotional intensity, Ava became quiet under pressure. Observant, calculating, she noticed details others ignored. Since Noah's death, she had started mentally collecting inconsistencies inside the family the same way detectives collected evidence. Her mother cried often now, but never at the right moments. That detail disturbed Ava more than anything else. Claire cried during funerals, during interviews, during conversations with police. But when she thought nobody was watching, her face changed completely. The grief disappeared too quickly. Sometimes Ava caught her staring blankly through windows toward the frozen lake with an expression that looked closer to fear than sadness. And lately, Daniel Mercer had started appearing at the house again. Always privately. Always late. 3 nights after Chloe's funeral, Ava woke around 1 a.m. after hearing voices downstairs. Rain tapped softly against her bedroom windows while icy wind moved through dead pine trees outside Blackwater Heights. The house remained dark except for faint kitchen lights glowing beneath the staircase. Ava moved quietly through the upstairs hallway barefoot, pulse slowly quickening as voices became clearer below. Claire was crying. "You promised this would stop," she whispered. Daniel Mercer answered calmly. "We didn't have a choice." Ava froze immediately. Daniel stood inside the kitchen wearing the same black wool coat he wore to nearly every funeral, snow melting slowly across broad shoulders beneath warm overhead lights. Tall, composed, devastatingly controlled even now, he looked completely different from the grieving father Blackwater saw publicly. Claire stood opposite him trembling beside the marble counter, pale skin almost colorless beneath swollen green eyes. "We're losing control," Claire whispered. Daniel's expression hardened. "No, you're losing control." The sentence terrified Ava more than shouting would have. Then Claire said something that made Ava physically cold. What if Helena already knows about the children? Children. Plural. Daniel stepped closer immediately. She can suspect whatever she wants. Suspicion isn't proof. Ava backed away silently before they could hear her breathing. Her entire body shook by the time she locked herself inside Noah's old bedroom upstairs. For nearly an hour, she sat on the floor staring at family photographs covering the walls. Noah laughing beside Ben Mercer years earlier. Chloe during summer vacations. Mason standing beside Ethan near the lake. Every image suddenly felt wrong now, like pieces of a lie carefully staged for years. Then Ava remembered Noah mentioning hidden letters shortly before he died. At 2:14 a.m., she began searching the house. The discovery came almost accidentally. Inside Claire's closet sat an old cedarwood storage box hidden beneath winter blankets and untouched photo albums. Ava opened it expecting ordinary keepsakes. Instead, she found 17 years of secrets. Hotel receipts, printed emails, photographs, and handwritten letters tied together carefully with faded blue ribbon. Most were signed only with initials. D and C. Ava's hands shook violently while reading them. The affair had lasted nearly 2 decades. Some letters discussed pregnancy fears. Others referenced the children directly. One contained a sentence so horrifying Ava reread it 3 times, trying to convince herself she misunderstood it. Sometimes I look at them and see us instead of them. Ava stopped breathing. Noah had been right. Everything. The blood types. The arguments. The murders. The children themselves were connected somehow. And people had started dying the moment they got too close to the truth. At 3:02 a.m., Ava called Detective Helena Voss from a gas station nearly 6 miles outside Blackwater after fleeing the house with the letters stuffed inside her backpack. Helena answered immediately. Ava spoke so fast Helena could barely follow her. "I found proof," she whispered. "About my mom and Daniel. About all of it." Rain hammered the station windows around her, while headlights moved slowly through darkness outside. Helena kept her voice calm. "Where are you?" "I don't want to say over the phone." "Are you safe?" Ava looked toward the parking lot instinctively. That was when she saw Daniel Mercer's black SUV pulling slowly into the station entrance. Her blood turned cold instantly. "He found me." "Ava, I think they know I found out." The line disconnected. Detective Helena Voss called back immediately. No answer. At 5:47 a.m., Ava Holloway's abandoned car was discovered near Briar County Road beside the frozen woods surrounding Blackwater Lake. The driver's door remained open. Her backpack was gone. So was Ava. Chapter 12. The Wrong Father. By the time Ava Holloway disappeared, Ethan Holloway had stopped recognizing his own reflection. The man staring back from mirrors inside the Holloway house looked hollowed out by grief and alcohol. His thick, dark stubble had grown uneven across a gaunt face permanently shadowed by exhaustion, while sleeplessness deepened the gray beneath restless eyes that no longer trusted anyone around him. At 45, Ethan still carried the broad frame and sharp features that once made courtroom juries fear him before he even spoke, but years of funerals, suspicion, and betrayal had stripped away every polished part of him. Now he looked dangerous, and Blackwater had started treating him like a monster. News coverage surrounding Ava's disappearance became vicious almost immediately. Television analysts replayed footage of Ethan screaming during previous police interviews, while internet forums labeled him the grieving father-turned-killer. Rumors spread across town claiming Ethan physically abused Noah before his death. Others insisted Ava ran away because she feared him. In Blackwater, people no longer whispered when Ethan entered restaurants or gas stations. They stared openly now. Some crossed the street entirely. The Holloway house became a prison. Tall windows overlooked the frozen black surface of Blackwater Lake, while winter storms rolled endlessly across Blackwater Heights, coating dead pine trees in thick ice beneath gray skies. Inside, untouched rooms sat frozen in memory. Noah's bedroom remained exactly as he left it. Ava's coat still hung near the staircase. Claire moved silently through hallways, avoiding Ethan completely, pale and emotionally fraying beneath constant fear. Neither spoke much anymore, because both now understood the marriage itself had been built on lies. 3 nights after Ava vanished, Ethan drove alone through heavy snowfall toward Briar County Medical Labs, nearly 40 miles outside Blackwater. The private facility sat isolated near the interstate beside empty winter fields, chosen specifically because nobody in Blackwater used it regularly. Ethan trusted no one local anymore. Not police, not Claire, not even himself. The DNA sample sat inside a sealed envelope beside him during the drive. Hair from Noah's old comb, Ava's toothbrush, and Ethan's own blood sample taken privately earlier that morning. The waiting nearly destroyed him. For 48 hours, Ethan barely slept inside his dark office overlooking the frozen lake, while whiskey bottles gathered beside unfinished legal paperwork across the desk. Snow drifted constantly outside the windows while television reporters discussed Ava's disappearance downstairs in the living room. Every possibility tore through his mind repeatedly. Maybe Noah was wrong. Maybe the blood types meant nothing. Maybe Claire only had an affair. Maybe the children were still his. But deep down, Ethan already knew the truth before the results arrived. At 6:17 p.m. on a freezing Sunday evening, the lab director handed Ethan a sealed envelope inside a small private conference room smelling faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. The older man spoke carefully, clearly uncomfortable now. There's no easy way to say this. Ethan opened the envelope himself. 3 pages, 3 probability charts, 3 conclusions. No biological relationship detected. Not with Noah. Not with Ava. Not with Lily. For several seconds, Ethan physically stopped breathing. The room became distant around him. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly while snowfall drifted beyond dark windows outside, but Ethan barely processed any of it. 20 years of fatherhood collapsed internally all at once. Every birthday, every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every funeral, gone. Or worse, stolen. When Ethan finally looked up again, something inside him had changed permanently. The drive back to Blackwater happened in complete silence. By the time he reached Blackwater Heights, police vehicles already surrounded his house. Blue and red lights flashed violently across frozen snow and dark windows, while neighbors gathered outside beneath winter coats, whispering nervously among themselves. Ethan's pulse quickened immediately. Detective Helena Voss stood near the garage entrance wearing her charcoal overcoat beneath falling snow, exhaustion sharp beneath gray eyes. The moment she saw Ethan, her expression darkened. "We found something." Inside the garage, forensic teams moved carefully around Ethan's black SUV. The same vehicle Noah's body had been discovered inside months earlier. The smell of gasoline and wet concrete hung heavily in the cold air, while photographers documented evidence beneath harsh portable floodlights. Then Ethan saw the chains. Rust-covered fishing chains identical to those used to weigh down Ben Mercer's body years earlier sat hidden beneath workbench tarps beside blood-stained gloves and a hunting knife carrying trace DNA linked to Mason Mercer. Ethan stared at the evidence in complete disbelief. "That's impossible." Helena watched him carefully. "When's the last time you came in here?" "I didn't put that there." His voice cracked harder than intended. Officers searched the rest of the property through the night. By midnight, investigators recovered burned photographs of the Mercer children, copies of anonymous threat letters, and deleted search history involving staged crime scenes. Everything pointed toward Ethan Holloway. Everything. Outside, Blackwater celebrated the discovery almost the same way it celebrated Raymond Hale's arrest years earlier. Reporters called Ethan the likely architect behind the family murders. Online forums exploded with theories portraying him as a jealous father driven insane after learning the children were not biologically his. Only Helena Voss remained uneasy. Near 3 a.m., she stood alone inside the evidence room studying the recovered chains beneath fluorescent light while snow continued falling softly outside the station windows. Something about the evidence bothered her immediately. Not what it proved, how perfectly it proved it. Too clean, too complete, too convenient. Then Helena noticed something that made her stomach tighten instantly. The chains recovered from Ethan's garage had no dust on them at all. Someone had placed them there recently. Chapter 13. The Fire. Detective Helena Voss received the final DNA report at 9:16 p.m. on a Wednesday night, while freezing rain battered Blackwater Police Department hard enough to shake the station windows. She had waited nearly 6 months for those results. 6 months of funerals. 6 months of dead children. 6 months of lies spreading through Blackwater like disease while innocent people were arrested, ruined, and publicly destroyed. And now, sitting alone inside her dim office beneath flickering fluorescent lights, Helena finally held the truth in her hands. The homicide division remained almost completely empty that night. Most officers had already gone home before the storm worsened, leaving only a handful of overnight staff moving quietly through distant hallways. The station smelled faintly of burnt coffee, wet winter coats, and old paper baking beneath overheated vents. Outside, icy rain slid down dark windows overlooking the parking lot, while thunder rolled softly across Blackwater Lake in the distance. Helena stared at the report for nearly 30 full seconds before opening it. Her pulse had already started accelerating, because deep down, she already knew what it would say. The DNA comparisons were devastatingly clear. Noah Holloway, biological father, Daniel Mercer. Ava Holloway, biological father, Daniel Mercer. Lily Holloway, biological father, Daniel Mercer. Helena slowly turned the page. Mason Mercer, biological father, Ethan Holloway. Chloe Mercer, biological father, Ethan Holloway. Ben Mercer, biological father, Ethan Holloway. For a long moment, Helena physically stopped moving. The station around her seemed to disappear beneath the weight of what she now understood. The children had not simply been victims. They had been evidence. Living proof of a secret affair buried nearly 2 decades beneath marriage, wealth, and carefully constructed family images. Every murder suddenly rearranged itself inside Helena's mind into something horrifyingly logical. Ben disappeared before rumors spread publicly. Noah died after investigating genetics. Mason vanished after secretly recording conversations about DNA. Chloe was killed after telling counselors the children belonged to the wrong parents. Ava disappeared immediately after discovering the affair letters. The children were dying because they were getting too close to the truth. Helena leaned backward slowly inside her chair, exhaustion crashing through her all at once. Years of homicide investigations had shown her cruelty in every form imaginable, but this felt different. More intimate, more evil. Parents were supposed to protect children, not erase them. Her office phone suddenly rang hard enough to make her flinch. Daniel Mercer. Helena stared at the caller ID silently while freezing rain continued striking the windows behind her. For several seconds, she considered ignoring the call entirely. Then she answered. Daniel's voice remained calm as always. Long night. The question immediately unsettled her. How'd you know I'm still here? A faint pause followed. Then Daniel laughed softly. You're always there lately. Helena said nothing. Tall, controlled, emotionally disciplined to an almost unnatural degree, Daniel Mercer had spent years presenting himself as Blackwater's grieving father. But now Helena heard something different beneath his voice for the first time. Calculation. What do you want? She asked coldly. Another pause. Then Daniel spoke quietly enough to sound almost sincere. Some truths destroy everyone they touch. The line disconnected. Helena sat frozen for several seconds afterward. Then she grabbed the DNA files and headed directly toward evidence storage downstairs. The records room sat beneath the station near old archive lockers and confiscated evidence, shelves rarely accessed after midnight. Concrete walls trapped stale heat and the faint chemical smell of aging paper, while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Helena secured the DNA reports inside temporary evidence storage personally before filing emergency requests for arrest warrants and immediate protective surveillance on both Claire Holloway and Daniel Mercer. For the first time since Ben Mercer disappeared, Helena believed the nightmare might finally end. At 2:11 a.m., the fire alarms activated. The explosion inside evidence storage shook the station hard enough to knock officers from chairs upstairs. Thick black smoke immediately poured through ventilation shafts while emergency sprinklers erupted across hallways. Helena sprinted downstairs through screaming alarms and flashing red lights, heart hammering violently as heat rolled upward through the stairwell. The records division was already burning. Flames consumed storage shelves rapidly, while smoke filled the corridor thick enough to blind anyone entering without breathing equipment. Officers dragged extinguishers through flooding water, while Helena shoved past them toward Evidence Locker 12, the temporary storage compartment containing the DNA reports. The locker had already melted shut. Inside, the files burned. Helena stood helplessly watching flames consume the final proof connecting the Mercer and Holloway children to their biological parents. Years of lies vanished inside minutes beneath collapsing shelves and boiling smoke, while sprinklers rained useless water across burning evidence. By sunrise, half the records division had been destroyed. Officials publicly blamed faulty electrical wiring caused by storm damage. Helena knew better. The fire started directly inside evidence storage. Someone had targeted those files specifically. Hours later, exhausted and smoke-covered, Helena sat alone inside the station security office reviewing surveillance footage from the night of the fire. Rain still hammered Blackwater outside, while technicians worked silently behind her attempting to recover damaged recordings. Then one technician frowned. Detective. Helena looked up immediately. The technician rewound the footage slowly. At 2 a.m., the cameras functioned normally. At 2:11 a.m., they returned. But between those timestamps, nothing. Exactly 11 minutes of footage had vanished completely. The exact same amount of time Blackwater's cameras failed the night Ben Mercer disappeared. Chapter 14. They Were Never Yours. The official investigation into the Blackwater murders collapsed 9 months after the evidence room fire. No arrests. No convictions. No recovered DNA files. What remained instead was a town permanently poisoned by suspicion. Blackwater looked different, now even during daylight. Storefronts along Main Street sat half-empty beneath fading winter decorations nobody bothered removing anymore. Restaurants closed earlier. Property values dropped. Families moved away whenever possible. The frozen lake overlooking Blackwater Heights had become less a landmark and more a reminder. a dark stretch of water forever connected to dead children and unanswered questions. People no longer spoke openly about justice. They spoke about survival. Ethan Holloway was released after prosecutors admitted the case against him could not survive trial without the destroyed DNA evidence and contaminated forensic chain of custody records. But freedom meant almost nothing now. His legal career collapsed entirely. Former clients abandoned him. Reporters followed him through town like scavengers searching for rage or confession. Online forums still called him the Holloway Butcher, despite the investigation officially stalling. And deep down, Ethan no longer cared whether people believed him innocent, because the truth had destroyed him anyway. The Holloway house overlooking Blackwater Lake stood nearly empty now. Most lights remained off after sunset, while snow piled untouched along the driveway and front steps. Inside, silence consumed everything. Noah's room remained frozen in time. Ava's coat still hung beside the staircase. Lily's toys remained inside unopened storage, bins nobody could emotionally handle moving. Claire Holloway still lived there, but barely. At 42, Claire looked physically diminished by grief and fear. Her pale skin carried permanent exhaustion, while the warmth people once trusted in her green eyes had faded into something hollow and constantly alert. She rarely left the house anymore except for work and mandatory police interviews that gradually became less frequent as the investigation died publicly. She and Ethan barely spoke now. When they did, it sounded like strangers discussing a shared tragedy instead of a marriage. Across town, Daniel Mercer adapted far better. Too well, according to Helena Voss. The Mercer home remained cold and elegant, overlooking the frozen shoreline, though only Daniel still lived there full-time. Julia Mercer filed for separation 3 months after Chloe's funeral and quietly relocated to an apartment outside Bryan County. Publicly, she claimed she could no longer survive inside a house filled with memories. Privately, Helena suspected something else. Julia no longer trusted Daniel. Maybe she never truly had. But without evidence, suspicion meant nothing. And that was the cruel genius of what happened inside Blackwater. Every suspect looked believable. Every theory almost made sense. The satanic panic, the jealous father, the grieving town unraveling psychologically, the serial predator theory. Each explanation carried just enough truth to bury the real one beneath it. Only Detective Helena Voss still refused to let go completely. At 43, Helena looked older than she had when Ben Mercer first disappeared years earlier. Long nights and obsession had carved exhaustion permanently beneath gray eyes, while cigarette smoke and stale coffee now seemed woven directly into her clothing. Officially, she remained assigned to active homicide review. Unofficially, everyone inside the department understood the truth. The Blackwater case was dead. Without DNA evidence, confessions, or surviving witnesses, prosecutors would never pursue charges against Claire Holloway or Daniel Mercer based purely on intuition. The law demanded proof, and the killers understood that better than anyone. 3 weeks after the case officially stalled, Helena received an anonymous call just before midnight. No voice, only directions. An abandoned lakeside cabin 12 miles outside Blackwater. The same cabin linked quietly to old hotel receipts recovered months earlier. Snow fell heavily during the drive. Helena's headlights cut through darkness while dead pine forests surrounded narrow roads leading toward the frozen shoreline outside town. By the time she reached the cabin, freezing wind howled across the lake hard enough to shake tree branches against the roof. The cabin lights were already on. Helena parked silently beyond the tree line and approached on foot through deep snow. Inside, Daniel Mercer and Claire Holloway sat near the fireplace together. For a moment, through the frost-covered windows, they almost looked ordinary again. Two exhausted people surviving grief. But Helena watched carefully. Daniel sat exactly as he always did, calm, controlled, emotionally measured beneath the flickering firelight. Claire looked far worse. Pale, trembling slightly. Hollowed by guilt she could no longer carry cleanly. Neither realized Helena stood outside listening. "We should have stopped after Noah," Claire whispered. Daniel stared into the fire. "We couldn't. They were children. They were asking questions." Claire's breathing became uneven. Ava was terrified. Daniel remained silent for several seconds before answering quietly. "So were we." The cabin fell silent except for wind outside and logs cracking softly inside the fireplace. Then Claire finally asked the question haunting both of them. "Do you think Helena knows?" Daniel looked toward the frozen, lake visible through the windows. She suspects. Claire's voice barely rose above a whisper. And if she keeps digging? Daniel turned slowly toward her. For the first time in years, emotion slipped visibly through his calm expression. Not grief. Fear. Then he said something Helena Voss would remember for the rest of her life. Suspicion isn't proof. Helena stood motionless outside the cabin, while snow drifted silently around her in the darkness. Inside, the Real killers sat only feet away from each other. Free. Untouched. Still protected by the absence of one final piece of evidence. And as Helena looked toward Daniel Mercer calmly pouring wine beside the fire, while Claire Holloway quietly cried into trembling hands, she realized something far more disturbing than the murders themselves. The scariest killers are the ones who still get invited to dinner.